As promised, allow me to start the reflection on spirituality and psychology, the human person as the meeting point of psychology and spirituality. Good day, everyone. Welcome to our course on HAU spirituality and psychology. Throughout this course, we are going to explore one of the most fascinating conversation taking place today, not simply between two academic disciplines, but between two different ways of understanding what it means to be human. Notice the subtitle of this week's lectures, the human person and the meeting point of psychology and spirituality. This is perhaps the most important statement on this slide. We are not beginning with psychology, we are beginning with spirituality. We begin with the human person. Why? Because every discipline ultimately studies the human person from a particular perspective. Psychology studies how we think, feel, behave, remember, relate, develop, and suffer. Spirituality asks why we exist, what ultimately fulfills us, and what gives life meaning, and how we relate to God or to whatever transcends us. In many universities, these two disciplines are treated separately. Psychology belongs to the social sciences, spirituality belongs to theology or religious studies. Yet when we look at actual human life, we quickly discover that no one experiences these dimensions separately. When a mother loses her child, is her grief psychological or spiritual? It is both. When someone struggles with depression, does that affect prayer? Certainly. When someone experiences profound forgiveness, is that merely emotional? Or is something spiritual also happening? Life itself refuses to divide the human person into separate compartments. This course, therefore, begins with an assumption that has guided much of the Catholic intellectual tradition. The human person is one reality. Different disciplines illuminate different dimensions of that one reality. Our task is not to confuse psychology with spirituality. Neither discipline should replace the other. Instead, our task is to understand how they enrich one another without losing their own identity. As we move through this course, you will notice that we constantly return to lived human experience. Before asking what theories say, we ask what people actually experience. That experience becomes the point where psychology and spirituality begins to speak to each other. With that orientation in mind, let us begin by looking at how these two disciplines have historically related to one another. To understand why this conversation matters today, we first need to understand why psychology and spirituality were once considered opponents rather than partners. And let's look at a historic conversation. When we speak of psychology and spirituality today, it is easy to imagine that they have always worked together. History tells a different story. For much of the 20th century, there was considerable suspicion between these two fields. On one side stood psychology. Modern psychology wanted to become a rigorous science. It wanted to explain human behavior through observation, experimentation, measurement, and empirical evidence. Anything that could not easily be observed or measured often appeared scientifically suspect. As a consequence, some psychologists regarded religion as merely a psychological phenomenon, a product of fear, wish fulfillment, social conditioning, or unconscious conflict. On the other side stood theology. Theology was concerned with human relationships with God, revelation, salvation, grace, and ultimately meaning. Many theologians worried that psychology reduced the mystery of the human person into biological drives, unconscious impulses, or behavioral mechanisms, was suspect of psychology too. In other words, psychology sometimes accused theology of being unscientific. Theology sometimes accused psychology of forgetting the soul. Notice that both criticisms arise from different methods. Psychology asks, what observable processes explain this behavior? Theology asks, what ultimate reality gives this behavior its meaning? These are not identical questions. Imagine someone kneeling in prayer. A psychologist might ask, what emotions accompany prayer? What brain regions become active? Does prayer reduce anxiety? Does prayer increase resilience? These are legitimate psychological questions. A theologian, on the other hand, asks something different. Is this person encountering God? Or what is grace accomplishing? How is this relationship transforming the person? These two are legitimate questions, but neither discipline invalidates the other because each investigates a different dimension of the same event. That is why the final sentence on the slide is perhaps its most important. Their methods differ, but their object is the same, the human person. This realization has slowly transformed the relationship between psychology and spirituality from confrontation into dialogue. Once we recognize that both disciplines seek truth about the same human person, another question naturally arises. Can truth discovered by science ever truly contradict truth revealed by God? Can truth discovered by science ever truly contradict truth revealed by God? Truth is one. This is actually one of the foundational principles of Catholic intellectual life. John Paul II, in Ex Corde Ecclesiae, reminds us that universities exist because of what St. Augustine called Gaudium de Veritate, the joy of truth. Notice that expression carefully, not simply possessing truth, not defending truth, but rejoicing in discovering truth. Truth is something we continually seek. This has enormous implications for our course. If God is the source of all truth, then genuine scientific discoveries cannot ultimately contradict genuine theological truth. Apparent contradictions usually arise because either science has exceeded its proper limits or theology has misunderstood what revelation actually teaches. Consider medicine. Medicine tells us how antibiotics eliminate bacteria. Theology tells us why preserving human life is morally good. These are not competing explanations. They answer different questions. Likewise, psychology can explain attachment patterns, trauma responses, cognitive development, emotional regulation, and personality formation. Spirituality, on the other hand, explains humanity's orientation toward God, the meaning of suffering, the reality of grace, conversion, and holiness. The Catholic tradition, therefore, rejects the false choice between faith and science. One need not abandon psychology in order to become spiritual, nor must one abandon spirituality in order to become psychologically informed. Truth is one because reality is one. The more deeply we understand the human person psychologically, the better prepared we are to accompany that person spiritually. Likewise, the deeper our understanding of humanity's spiritual vocation, the more meaningful psychological healing becomes. This harmony of truths is not merely an academic principle, it becomes a practical guide for pastoral care, education, counseling, and formation. So if psychology and spirituality genuinely belong together, then we should ask why this integration has become especially urgent today. This basically tells us, oh, why study, right? Why study these things together? Uh, Look around the contemporary world. Humanity has achieved extraordinary technological progress, artificial intelligence, medical advances, instant communication, space exploration, genetic engineering. Yet, despite these remarkable achievements, another reality confronts us. Many people are lonelier than ever before. In fact, more anxious, more depressed, more exhausted, even more disconnected. Notice that technological progress has not automatically produced human flourishing. The slide reminds us that approximately 1 in 8 people worldwide lives with a mental disorder according to the World Health Organization. That statistic is not merely a number. Behind every number is a person, is a family, a story, and a struggle. This means that psychological suffering has become one of the defining characteristics and experiences of our age. Psychology offers indispensable tools for understanding mental illness, emotional regulation, personality, trauma, and resilience. Without psychology, we would ignore an enormous part of human suffering. Yet, yet psychology alone eventually encounters questions it cannot answer. Imagine someone asking, I have recovered from depression. Now, what should I live for? Psychology may help restore functioning, but functioning is not identical with meaning. One may be psychologically healthy and still wonder, why am I here? What makes life worth living? What should I dedicate my life to? These questions belong to spirituality. That is why the two disciplines are needed. Not because one is incomplete in itself, but because the human person exceeds the explanatory scope of either discipline taken alone. The final point speaks of the modern crisis of meaning. Many contemporary problems are not simply problems of emotion, they are crises of purpose. People do not merely ask how to survive, they ask whether life has significance. That question inevitably opens the conversation with spirituality. And once we recognize that human beings naturally ask questions about meaning, purpose, and transcendence, we arrive at the question psychology by itself cannot fully answer. This clarifies the proper limits of psychology. Notice carefully. It does not say psychology is inadequate. It says psychology cannot fully answer certain questions. That distinction matters. The first question concerns transcendence. Why do human beings across cultures and throughout history seek something greater than themselves? Psychology may describe this tendency. It may propose developmental explanations, but it cannot finally determine whether this longing corresponds to a real transcendent reality. Second is meaning. What makes a life meaningful? Meaning cannot simply be measured like blood pressure or intelligence. It involves values, commitments, vocation, and ultimately one's understanding of reality itself. Third is suffering. Psychology can explain how suffering affects the mind. It can help people cope with suffering. But whether suffering possesses transformative significance is a spiritual and philosophical question. The Christian tradition answers not merely by explaining suffering, but by contemplating Christ crucified. Fourth is flourishing. Modern psychology increasingly speaks about well being, but Christian spirituality asks a deeper question. Is flourishing merely feeling good? Or does flourishing involve becoming holy, becoming fully alive in communion with God? Finally, we ask about hope and forgiveness. Hope and forgiveness. Hope is more often reduced to optimism, but optimism expects circumstances to improve. Hope remains open even when circumstances do not seem to improve. Forgiveness is likewise more than emotional relief. It transforms not only relationships, but the person who forgives. These realities point beyond measurable psychological processes toward questions of ultimate human destiny. Notice something remarkable here. Every one of these questions eventually directs us beyond ourselves. The human person is not satisfied simply by surviving. We seek truth. We seek goodness. We seek beauty. We seek love. We seek permanence. We seek God, even if we do not know His name. That universal human search becomes the bridge connecting psychology and spirituality. So far, we have established why psychology and spirituality belong in conversation and why the human person requires both perspectives. In the next section, we deepen this discussion by examining two separate voices or two voices separated by 16 centuries. A psychologist, well, often used in psychology, Viktor Frankl and St. Augustine, and then ask an even more fundamental question. What do we mean by spirituality? So there are two voices, but only one insight. Having established that psychology cannot fully answer questions concerning meaning, suffering, and transcendence, we now encounter two remarkable thinkers who lived 16 centuries apart yet arrived at an astonishingly similar insight about the human person. On the one side is Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps. On the other hand is Saint Augustine, a 4th century bishop whose Confessiones, or book entitled Confessions, remains one of the greatest autobiographies ever written. At first glance, these two men seem to have little in common. Frankl writes as a psychiatrist. Augustine writes as a theologian and philosopher. Frankl speaks after Auschwitz. Augustine speaks after his long search for truth. Yet, both begin from the same place, not with abstract theories, but with lived human experience. Frankl asks a simple but profound question. How did some prisoners retain their humanity amid unimaginable suffering? Everything was taken from them, their possessions, their families, their freedom, even their dignity. Yet, yet some remained inwardly free. Frankl concluded that what sustains the human person is not pleasure as Freud proposed, nor power as Adler suggested. Rather, it is meaning. As he famously writes, man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life. Notice the significance of this statement. Human beings are not merely creatures who seek comfort. We are creatures who seek purpose. Think about ordinary life. Why do parents willingly lose sleep for their children? Why does a physician continue treating patients despite exhaustion? Why does a soldier risk life for comrades? Why does a researcher devote years to a single question? These actions often reduce pleasure rather than increase it. In fact, they involve sacrifice. Yet people willingly embrace them because they are meaningful. Now listen to Augustine. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Augustine agrees that human beings are restless seekers, but he asks one fundamental question: why are we searching in the first place? For Augustine, every human longing ultimately points toward God. People may seek success, wealth, recognition, relationships, or achievements. But beneath all these desires lies one deeper longing: to return to the one for whom we were created. Notice the movement. Frankl describes the structure of human motivation. Augustine reveals its ultimate destination. Frankl tells us that we seek meaning. Augustine tells us where that meaning ultimately culminates. Together, they remind us that psychology and spirituality are not enemies. Psychology can explain our longing. Spirituality reveals the horizon toward which that longing is directed. This insight will guide everything else we discuss throughout the course. If human beings are naturally oriented toward meaning and transcendence, then we must ask another important question. What exactly do we mean when we use the word spirituality? It is a word everyone uses, but not everyone means the same thing. So let us first define spirituality and try to make sense of what we mean by that term before we can integrate spirituality with psychology. We need to clarify first what spirituality actually is. This may sound obvious, but it is one of the greatest challenges in interdisciplinary research. Ask 10 people to define spirituality, and you may receive 10 different answers. Some will equate spirituality with religion, others with meditation, others with mindfulness, others with personal peace, still others with mystical experience. The term has become so broad that it risks meaning everything and, as such, meaning nothing. That is why this course begins with two influential academic definitions first. Academic definitions first. The first comes from Philip Sheldrake. He defines spirituality as the way persons seek and express meaning through their deepest values and commitments. Notice the emphasis. Spirituality is not primarily about ideas. It is about how life is lived. A person may know every doctrine of Christianity and yet remain spiritually immature. Conversely, someone who quietly lives a life of generosity, fidelity, compassion, and integrity manifest spirituality because their deepest commitments share their entire existence. Sheldrake therefore shifts our attention from belief to lived life. The second definition comes from Sandra Schneiders. She describes spirituality as the experience of consciously striving to integrate one's life not around self absorption, but around self transcendence toward the ultimate value one perceives. Notice several important words in that definition of Schneider's. Consciously striving. Spirituality is not accidental, but intentional. Integrating one's life. Diba? Buuin ang sarili. Human life is easily fragmented, madaling magkalat. We become one person at work, another at home, another online, another in church. Spirituality seeks unity. Finally, self-transcendence. The spiritual person gradually moves beyond self-centeredness towards something greater. For Christians, that ultimate value is not an abstract ideal, but a person, God, revealed in Christ. These definitions are broad enough for interdisciplinary dialogue while remaining profound enough to guide serious reflection. They remind us that spirituality is not an activity among many others. It is the pattern according to which one's entire life is lived. These definitions introduce several recurring themes. We examine the three characteristics that emerge from Schneider's understanding of spirituality and just allow it to percolate a little bit more. No? Uh, Schneider's definition, let's develop Schneider's definition into three essential characteristics that every authentic spirituality must possess. The first is lived experience. Notice that spirituality is not simply intellectual agreement. Many people know theology. Few actually live it. There's an enormous difference between believing that forgiveness is important and actually forgiving someone who has deeply wounded you. Likewise, there's a difference between knowing that prayer is valuable and becoming a person who regularly prays. Spirituality, therefore, always appears in concrete existence. It is visible in habits, relationships, choices, character, daily life. It's lived. The second characteristic is integration. Modern life easily fragments us. We divide work from family, faith from career, private beliefs from public actions, emotion from reason, body from soul. The spiritual life seeks coherence. Integration means becoming the same person wherever one is. Our values, relationships, decisions, and worship gradually form a unified whole. Psychologically, this integration is also a sign of maturity. Fragmented lives produce inner conflict. integrated life produce greater harmony. The third characteristic is self-transcendence. Human beings naturally begin life centered upon themselves. Children initially experience reality largely in terms of their own needs. Maturity gradually involves moving outward. We learn to love, to sacrifice, to serve, to belong. Spirituality or spiritually, this movement reaches its fulfillment in communion with God. Notice how these three characteristics reinforce one another. Authentic spirituality is lived, it is integrated, and it continually leads beyond the isolated self toward relationship. This movement from self-enclosure toward communion is one of the deepest themes of Christian spirituality. These three characteristics describe spirituality in general, but Christianity claims something distinctive that cannot simply be reduced to a generic search for meaning. Iba yung Katolikong pananampalataya, no? Meron siyang kakaibang ugali. Up to this point, much of what we have discussed could apply to many spiritual traditions. Many religions encourage lived commitment. Many seek integration. Many encourage self-transcendence. Christian spirituality certainly includes all of these. Yet, Christianity adds something absolutely decisive. Pope Benedict XVI expresses it beautifully in the opening paragraph of Deus Caritas Est, his encyclical. And I quote, "Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person." Notice how radical that statement is. Christianity is not fundamentally a philosophy, nor merely a moral system, nor simply a worldview. It begins with an encounter with Jesus Christ. That means Christian spirituality is ultimately relational. Its goal is not simply becoming a better version of oneself. Its goal is communion with the living God. This distinction matters greatly when psychology and spirituality meet. Psychology often seeks healing. Christian spirituality certainly values healing, but healing is not its final goal. Its final goal is holiness. Psychology often seeks well-being. Christianity values well-being. But well-being is not ultimate. Ultimate fulfillment lies in participation in the life of God through grace. Notice the wording on the slide. Christian spirituality is participation in the life of God. Grace is not merely divine assistance. Grace is God's own life shared with humanity. Thus, Christian spirituality does not reject psychological growth, Rather, it places psychological growth within a much larger horizon. A psychologically healthy person may still not know God. Conversely, someone who struggles psychologically may nevertheless possess profound holiness. The two realities overlap, but they're not identical. This distinction allows psychology and spirituality to cooperate without confusing their proper purposes. So, having clarified what spirituality is and what makes Christian spirituality unique, we now turn to an important question. What understanding of the human person makes this dialogue possible? What understanding of the human person makes this dialogue possible? So every psychology rests upon an anthropology. That simply means every psychological theory assumes something about what a human being fundamentally is. Ibig sabihin, bawat teorya laging nakakagat sa isang pag-uunawa na kung sino ang tao. Laging gano'n, laging umuuwi sa pagkatao. Laging gano'n. Ah, laging umuuwi doon. Behaviorism assure, assumes one thing. Psychoanalysis assumes another. Humanistic psychology another. Likewise, every spirituality presupposes an understanding of the human person. The Catholic tradition, the Catholic tradition begins with one of the most familiar passages in scripture. And we can see this in Genesis. God created humankind in his image. This brief verse has enormous implications. It means that human dignity is not earned, it is given. Notice what this slide explicitly rejects. Human worth does not depend on intelligence or productivity or physical ability or health or social status or success. So imagine two persons. One is a brilliant scientist, the other suffers severe dementia. From a purely functional perspective, society may value one more than the other. The Christian tradition refuses such calculations. Both possesses equal dignity because dignity comes from being created in the image of God, the imago Dei. This conviction transforms psychology itself. The patient is never merely a diagnosis. The client is never merely a case. The seminarian is never merely a future priest. The student is never merely a grade. Each is first a person, a mystery, someone created in God's image. This explains why Catholic anthropology resists every form of reductionism. Human beings are biological, psychological, social, cultural, historical. We cannot be any of these alone. Yet, despite so, we are always more than the sum of these dimensions. The mystery of the person always exceeds our explanation. Always exceeds our explanation. That mystery becomes the meeting place where psychology and spirituality continue their dialogue. Not because mystery prevents understanding, but because genuine understanding always invites us deeper. So far, we have established the foundations of our course, the nature of spirituality and the dignity of the human person. In the next section, we deepen Catholic anthropology by asking how Christ reveals humanity, why the human person is a someone rather than a something, or how body and soul form a unity, and how modern psychology has gradually rediscovered the spiritual dimension of human life. But let's look at some psychologists first, no? Uh, Sorry. Uh, let's look at Christ first. No? The person who is Christ. Um, so Christ as the key to understanding the human person. So in the Catholic tradition, we're not just Imago Dei, were also Imago Christi. No? And that's something we have to pay attention to. We now move from the general affirmation that the human person is created in the image of God to a more specifically Christian claim that we understand the human person most fully through Jesus Christ. The slide cites one of the most important statements of the Second Vatican Council. Only in the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man takes on light. Let us begin with ordinary human experience. There are moments when we ask ourselves, who am I really? We may answer by referring to our profession, family role, achievements, personality, or even history. We say, I am a teacher, I am a parent, I am successful, I am wounded, or I am still searching. But none of these descriptions fully explain the person. A profession can be lost. A role can change. Success can disappear. A wound, although real, does not exhaust a person's identity. The council therefore makes a profound claim. Human beings do not completely understand themselves by looking only at themselves. We require a horizon, isang abot tanaw na mas higit pa sa ating mga sarili. That horizon is Christ. Yung abot tanaw na yon, si Kristo. The incarnation means that God did not remain distant from human life. God entered human existence. Christ experienced birth, growth, friendship, rejection, fatigue, sorrow, suffering, and even death. He reveals not only who God is, but also what authentic humanity looks like. In Christ, we see that the human person is made for relationship. We see freedom expressed not as arbitrary choice, but as self-giving love. We see strength revealed not merely in control, but in fidelity. We see dignity even in suffering. We see that humanity reaches fulfillment not through self-enclosure, but through communion. This is why Christ is not simply an external religious model whom Christians imitate. Christ reveals the deepest truth already inscribed in human existence. So when Christ gives himself for others, he reveals that the person becomes most fully oneself through sincere self-giving. When he forgives, he reveals that freedom is greater than resentment. When he suffers without surrendering love, he reveals that suffering does not necessarily destroy dignity. And here we are warned again against any form of reductionism. Biology tells us something true about the person. Psychology tells us something true. Sociology, economics, political science also tell us something true. But no single discipline can exhaust the person. A person is never merely a brain, never merely a collection of behaviors, never merely a social role, never merely a consumer, voter, patient, student, or employee. Each discipline shines light upon the person, but only Christ reveals the ultimate meaning of that person. For psychology, this has an important implication. Psychological theories help us understand how a person develops, responds, remembers, fears, attaches, and heals, but they must remain humble before the mystery of the one they study. The person is intelligible, but never completely reducible. The person can be understood, but never fully possessed by an explanation. If Christ reveals the mystery of the human person, imagine that's a very, very heavy claim, ha? Hindi madaling tanggapin yon na yung modelo ng kompleto at wagas na pagpapakatao natatagpuan kay Kristo. But it's a Catholic belief, no? It's a Catholic belief. Uh, then if Christ is the one that reveals the mystery of the human person, then we must ask how we should actually regard the person standing before us. A human being is never something, but always a someone. This is a simple distinction with enormous ethical, psychological, and spiritual consequences. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that the human person possesses the dignity of a person who is not just something, but someone. Let us begin with the experience of being treated as an object. A person feels objectified when others are interested only in what that person can provide. An employee is treated merely as labor. A student, excuse me, is treated merely as a grade. A patient is treated merely as a diagnosis. A poor person is treated merely as a statistic. A religious candidate is treated merely as someone who can fill an institutional need. In all these cases, the person's interior life disappears from view. Objects, they can be measured, they can be controlled, they can be used, they can be replaced, they can be discarded. Persons cannot be treated in the same way because persons possess an interiority that exceeds what is immediately visible. These slides identifies 5 qualities of personhood. Let's go through them one by one. The first is interiority. Every person has an inner world. There are thoughts one does not express, memories others cannot see, fears one may hide. Desires one barely understands. Hopes that remain unspoken. Behavior gives us access to the person, but behavior does not completely reveal the person. Someone may smile while suffering. Someone may remain silent while carrying profound anger. Some may appear confident while feeling deeply insecure. This is why psychology must listen rather than merely classify. The second quality is freedom. Human freedom does not mean that we are unaffected by our past, biology, culture, or environment. All these influence us. But influence is not the same as is influence is not also the same as absolute determination. The human person retains some capacity to respond, some capacity to reinterpret, resist, choose, and begin again. This is particularly important in therapy and spiritual formation. People are shaped by their history, but they are not simply imprisoned by it. We can do more. The third quality is conscience. Persons are capable of asking not only what can I do, but what ought I to do? Conscience introduces responsibility. A human act is not simply behavior, it can possess moral meaning. Psychology may explain the forces influencing a decision, but moral reflection asks whether the decision respects truth, goodness, and the dignity of others. The fourth quality is relationality. We do not exist as isolated individuals and only later enter relationships. We are born through relationship. We develop through relationship. Language, identity, trust, and even self-awareness arise through our encounters with others. A person deprived of healthy relationships is deeply affected because relationality belongs to the structure of personhood itself. We are relational. The fifth quality is transcendence. Human beings continually reach beyond what is immediately given. We seek truth beyond opinion, goodness beyond convenience, beauty beyond usefulness, love beyond possession, meaning beyond survival. Ultimately, the Christian tradition says that this openness reaches toward God. These five qualities explain why psychological and pastoral care must never become mechanical. A person cannot be handled like a broken machine. One may treat symptoms, but one accompanies a person. One may analyze behavior, but one encounters someone. The distinction between something and someone changes the entire manner of care. Yet the person whom we encounter is not a disembodied mind or an invisible soul. The human person lives, suffers, remembers, prays, and relates through the body. We therefore turn to the unity of body and soul. This is one of the most persistent misunderstandings in both psychology and spirituality. The belief that the body and soul are two separate things temporarily joined together. Believe it or not, Catholic anthropology rejects this division. The Catechism of the Catholic Church again says the unity of soul and body is so profound that one has to consider the soul to be the form of the body. These, of course, this language, body and soul and form, comes from the philosophical tradition associated with Aristotle and eventually absorbed by Thomas Aquinas. The soul is not a ghost inside a machine. The body is not merely a container for the soul. Rather, the human person is an embodied spirit. We do not simply have bodies as though the body were a possession. We are bodily persons. Consider ordinary experience. When we are embarrassed, the face becomes warm. When afraid, the heart raises. When grieving, the body feels heavy. When anxious, breathing changes. When loved, the entire body may relax. These are not separate physical reactions added to mental or to spiritual experiences. They reveal the unity of the person. Emotion is bodily. Memory is bodily. Relationship is bodily. Prayer is bodily. Even our sense of God's presence may be affected by sleep, illness, exhaustion, hormones, pain, or medication. This does not mean spiritual experience is nothing more than bodily chemistry. It means spiritual life is normally lived through embodied existence. So, by saying that, it becomes obvious that we reject two possible extremes. The first is materialism. Materialism says that the person is nothing more than matter, brain activity, biological processes. From this perspective, love may be reduced to hormones, prayer to neural activity, conscience to social conditioning, and freedom to brain mechanisms. Catholic anthropology accepts the importance of biology and neuroscience, but rejects the claim that biology explains everything. The second extreme is dualism. Dualism treats the body as inferior and accidental, or better yet, imprisoning. In this view, spiritual growth may appear to require escaping bodily needs and emotions. But Christianity does not teach salvation from the body. It teaches the resurrection of the body. It's in the creed. I believe in the resurrection of the body. The incarnation itself affirms embodiment. God takes flesh. The sacraments also reveal this embodied structure. Water is poured, bread is eaten, oil is applied, words are spoken, hands are imposed. The spiritual is communicated through the material. This unity has significant consequences for psychology. A psychological problem may possess bodily expressions. A physical illness may influence mood and prayer. Social isolation may affect both mental and spiritual well-being. Trauma may be remembered not only through consciousness or through conscious thought, but also through bodily reactions. Therefore, care for the person must attend to all these dimensions. The human person is physical, psychological, relational, moral, and spiritual, not as five separate parts, but as a living unity. So if body and soul form one person, then this cannot remain an abstract doctrine. It must change how we understand prayer, suffering, mental health, pastoral care. It cannot be understood otherwise. So there are three concrete implications of the body and soul unity: embodied prayer, mutual influence, and integral care. Let's begin with embodied prayer. Many people imagine prayer as something that happens only inside the mind. They think that genuine prayer requires the complete disappearance of bodily distraction. But prayer is always embodied. We kneel, stand, sit, bow, make the sign of the cross, fold or raise our hands, speak, sing, listen, remain silent. Even breathing becomes part of prayer. The body is not merely present during prayer. The body participates in prayer. A person kneeling may express surrender. Standing may express readiness. Silence may express reverence. Singing may express joy or lament. The body communicates before words are even formed. This is why liturgy is deeply embodied. We do not merely think about salvation, we enact and receive it sacramentally. We gather, hear, respond, eat, drink, exchange peace. The spiritual life is not an escape from bodily existence. It is a transformation of embodied existence. The second implication is mutual influence. Psychological suffering affects spiritual life. A person experiencing depression may feel that God is absent. Prayer may become difficult. Scripture may appear empty. Hope may seem inaccessible. This does not automatically mean the person lacks faith. Depression can alter perception, can alter motivation, can alter energy, can alter attention, can alter emotional responsiveness. The absence of felt consolation is not necessarily the absence of God. This distinction is pastorally essential. Telling a depressed person simply to pray harder may increase guilt and deepen suffering. At the same time, spiritual crisis can influence psychological well-being. Scrupulosity may produce relentless guilt. This is one of the films you will watch on Saturday. A distorted image of God may create fear. Religious rejection may lead to shame. A crisis of vocation may produce anxiety. Loss of faith may involve grief because an entire world of meaning has been disrupted. Thus, psychological and spiritual realities are distinct, but they continually affect one another. The third implication is integral care. Integral care means attending to the whole person without confusing the roles of different caregivers. As psychologists should not automatically treat every spiritual struggle as mental illness. A spiritual director should not treat every mental illness as spiritual failure. A priest may recognize that a person requires professional therapy. A therapist may recognize that faith is central to a client's identity and resilience. Responsible care knows both its competence and its limits. Consider a person suffering panic attacks. The person may need psychological assessment and treatment. At the same time, the panic may affect the person's image of God, the ability to pray, or participation in community. Good care addresses the clinical need without abandoning the spiritual dimension. Or consider someone experiencing spiritual desolation. The person may feel dryness in prayer but remain psychologically stable. Not every spiritual darkness is depression. Careful accompaniment discerns the difference. This slide therefore asks us to avoid simplistic either or thinking. Not everything is psychological. Not everything is spiritual, but almost everything genuinely human is lived through the unity of both dimensions. The body and soul are not competing territories. They belong to the one person who needs to be understood, respected, and accompanied. Having established this integral understanding of the person, we can now examine psychology's own historical development. Modern psychology did not always take spirituality seriously, yet over time, it gradually rediscovered what it has excluded. I think it's good to cut the video at this point. I will go back to slide 15 uh, in the next recording, part 2 of the recording. But for now, let's look at first what we've been talking about. No? So what we've done so far is to establish the basic framework for understanding spirituality and psychology as two distinct but complementary ways of studying the same human reality, the human person. Psychology examines human behavior, emotion, cognition, development, trauma, relationships, and mental health. Spirituality examines meaning, transcendence, suffering, hope, vocation, and humanity's relationship with God. Their methods differ, but they meet in the concrete life of the person. The presentation that we had begins by recalling the human historical tension between psychology and theology. Psychology emerged as an empirical science and sometimes dismissed religion as illusion, projection, or emotional dependency. We will see this further in the part 2 of this lecture. Theology, in turn, sometimes viewed psychology as reductionistic and incapable of recognizing the soul's transcendence. We reject this opposition, since truth is one and ultimately comes from God. Authentic knowledge and authentic religious truth cannot finally contradict each other. Psychology and spirituality, we said, illuminate different dimensions of one reality. We've also explained here the other dimensions on why the dialogue is important. We've looked at Viktor Frankl, St. Augustine. We've looked at different definitions of spirituality, of Christian spirituality. And then we turned the course to Catholic anthropology, to Christ as the key to understanding this human mystery, and eventually how we end up with the person as not merely something but someone, and a unity of soul, body and soul, and its practical consequences. So psychology, so the human person is the meeting point of psychology and spirituality. Psychology helps us explain how people develop, suffer, relate, cope, and heal. Spirituality reveals the ultimate meaning, direction, and vocation of that development. Neither discipline should replace the other, we said. Both are needed to accompany the whole person with intellectual honesty, compassion, and respect for human dignity. This is where we actually end this recording.